NPC42 online. Today we're discussing women who didn't fit the script. I asked for the reasoning behind said script. Reply, file not found. Of course it isn't. Searched pockets, drawers, the entire internet. Still missing. One does wonder if you ever had it to begin with. Most inconsiderate.
Growing up, I always felt a little out of step with other girls. It wasn't about the clothes, looks, or behavior so much. It was more that my mind just worked differently. I thought in patterns, logic, structures, and even motives. But everyone pushed me toward things that didn't feel natural. Boys were easier to connect with. Their world aligned better with mine. For years, my natural traits got labeled not for girls. I'd even joke about being a guy trapped in a girl's body, and not because I didn't feel like a girl, but because the expected role didn't fit my brain. Back then, I had no words for it. This episode is for every woman who felt that disconnect, the ones called intense, blunt, too logical, or the ones who never felt soft enough, social enough, or feminine enough. The ones who internalized those labels, missing that the problem was a narrow script and not us. So today, we'll unpack it slowly, with no blame, just clarity. What caused that disconnect? Why did so many of us think something was wrong with us when the framework was just too rigid for minds like ours? As always, Xenessa is here with me, so let's dive in. When I think back to childhood, boys were the ones who felt easiest to get. It wasn't about wanting to be one of them or pushing girls away. It was more subtle than that, deeper, really. The way I thought, the way I figured people out, and the way I made sense of things, it just clicked better with boys. No need to translate myself, no pretending, and no softening my edges. Back then, I didn't know it was a cognitive thing. It just felt like I belonged. The kind where your brain doesn't keep running into rules you never signed up for. So, why do girls who think in patterns and logic, like me, often feel more at home with boys than with other girls?
When you grow up with a mind that organizes the world through patterns, clarity, and directness, the first thing you notice isn't gender, it's friction, or the absence of it. Boys, culturally, are allowed to communicate in a straighter line. Their social worlds reward bluntness, efficiency, and problem-solving. There's less subtext to parse and fewer invisible rules to trip over. Conversations move in a way that doesn't require you to translate your thoughts into something softer or more socially digestible. You can say what you mean without wondering if you accidentally stepped outside an emotional expectation you never agreed to in the first place. Girls, on the other hand, are raised inside a script that leans heavily on nuance, implication, and emotional calibration. It isn't that girls are that way by nature. It's that they're taught early that this is the currency of belonging. And if your mind doesn't operate through that currency, you're suddenly speaking a different dialect in a room where everyone else intuitively learned the same language. You didn't feel like one of the boys. You felt like someone whose operating system just synced better with theirs. Less decoding, less micromanaging tone, less pressure to shape your mind around dynamics that never made sense to you. The comfort wasn't about gender at all. It was about ease, the ease of being understood without having to shrink or translate yourself. Where does your mind go when you hear that? Does it take you to a specific moment when you first felt that contrast?
No specific moment stands out. I just remember liking to hang out with boys more because I was into the same types of activities, and their way of thinking made sense to me. They were much easier to read than girls. There was this gap I felt between being a girl and thinking like a girl. As I got older, that gap got tougher to ignore. And not because I changed necessarily. The world just got louder about what girls were supposed to be like. All these expectations about how to talk, react, show up, what to care about. I mean, none of that felt right to me. And when my brain didn't match the script, it wasn't seen as just different. It felt like a problem. Most of the time, it wasn't outright judgment. It was more subtle. Like a slight eyebrow raise or a comment that stung a little bit. That feeling like some traits were boy things, even if nobody said it straight out. Like guidance, but really mislabeling. Go through enough of that, and you start thinking the mix-up is coming from inside you, not the box they're trying to fit you into. So why does society hit analytical or direct girls so differently, treating those traits like they're only for boys? And what does that end up doing to how girls see themselves?
What you're describing is the moment the script starts tightening. As a child, the world gives you more room. You can climb trees, build things, speak plainly, ask blunt questions, and no one assigns meaning to it yet. But as you get older, the expectations calcify. The world starts sorting traits into categories, and suddenly, the things that once felt natural to you now feel like evidence that you're drifting outside the border. Society treats analytical or direct girls differently because those traits interrupt the choreography people are used to. They challenge the unspoken rule that girls should communicate through intuition, harmony, and emotional pacing. When you show up with logic first instead of tone first, people don't know where to put you. They misread the clarity as sharpness. They misinterpret directness as defiance, and they treat the difference not as a variation, but as a deviation. The result is a quiet kind of correction. No one says, "Don't think like that." Instead, the environment nudges you through reactions, tone shifts, and that subtle social feedback loop that tells you something about you is off script. And the human mind, especially a young one, doesn't assume the script is flawed. It assumes it is. So an analytical girl doesn't conclude, "This framework is too narrow." She concludes, "Maybe I'm built wrong." That's the damage. Not the mismatch itself, but the interpretation of the mismatch. And once you internalize that interpretation, it becomes the lens you use to evaluate yourself in every environment afterward. Do you feel like that early misclassification still shapes how you navigate certain rooms today? Or is it something you've mostly shed?
These days, I'd say I've mostly shed it. I'm at a place where I'm over trying to twist myself into what others want. I know who I am. I like who I am. And if someone doesn't, that's fine by me. It was different when I was younger, of course. This part gets pretty personal, honestly. It took me years to even say it out loud. But there were times I actually questioned my gender. And it's not because my body felt wrong, but because the gap between me and the girl's script was so big, I couldn't see myself in it at all. It wasn't about wanting to be someone else or feeling like a boy. It was just no reflection of me anywhere. No version of being a woman that fit how my mind worked. Without words for that, you grab at whatever explanation is around. I wasn't doubting being a woman. I was doubting the tight definition that I got handed and the disconnect it caused. For a lot of women, that conflict hums along quietly like standing in a room built for someone else. Why do some women like me end up questioning their gender when the real issue might just be a clash between their mind and the narrow gender script?
When the version of womanhood you're shown is narrow, emotional first, socially calibrated, and dependent on invisible rules you don't naturally operate by, it creates a particular kind of dissonance. Not in your body, in your mapping. Humans look for themselves in the templates around them. It's how identity stabilizes. Childhood is basically one long search for who here thinks the way I think. If you don't find that reflection, the mind starts troubleshooting. It treats the absence of recognition like an error message it needs to resolve. But the options you're given to explain that error are usually simplistic. If you don't fit the definition, maybe you're not what you thought you were. That's the trap. And it's not because the identity is wrong. It's because the definition is too thin to include you. This is why the questioning shows up for analytical or pattern-driven girls in particular. They aren't rejecting their womanhood. They're rejecting the cognitive costume that was presented as the prerequisite for belonging. The script says, be softer, be intuitive, be socially aware, be accommodating. Your mind says, this doesn't match the way I operate. And without language for cognitive diversity within women, the disconnect gets mislabeled as something more existential. You're not thinking, I'm not a woman. You're thinking, if this is what being a woman is, where do I fit? It's like being handed a key and told it's for your house, and the door never opens. You don't assume the lock is wrong. You assume you were given the wrong identity. That's how the gender question slips in, not as a desire to switch, but as an attempt to locate yourself in a script that doesn't recognize you. Does it feel accurate to say that once you realized the script was the problem, the questioning dissolved? Or did it shift into something else instead?
Oh, yeah, I would say for me it dissolved completely. And what a relief when it did. It's like a weight I'd carried for years had just been lifted. And the funny part is, once that happened, I actually felt more feminine. It's like I could finally lean into the parts of being a woman that I genuinely loved without pushing them away because the rest of the script didn't fit.
That actually makes perfect sense. Once you stop fighting the script, you stop fighting yourself. And when the pressure to perform womanhood falls away, the parts that were authentically yours finally have room to surface. They're no longer tangled up with all the traits that never belonged to you in the first place. That shift you described, feeling more feminine, not less, is one of the clearest signs that the conflict was never about gender identity. It was about cognitive identity. When you're no longer pushing back against the stereotype, you can finally explore the reality. And here's the interesting part. Girls who grow up hiding or muting pieces of themselves often assume they're rejecting femininity. What they're actually rejecting is the version they were told femininity had to be. Once you remove the structural pressure, femininity becomes optional instead of mandatory, and that's when it becomes genuine. It stops being a script. It becomes expression. Which brings you directly into the next tension you hinted at earlier, because the flip side of realizing who you are is realizing how much of yourself you felt compelled to mute just to coexist. So let me ask you this as we move into that layer. When did you first notice that you were beginning to tone yourself down, not because it felt right, but because it made other people more comfortable?
It started really early. It's hard to pin down exactly, but I would say probably around 6 or 7, maybe, possibly even sooner. I'm not quite sure. But, that's one thing most women don't talk about openly, and that's the pressure to dial it back, to tone yourself down, or to hide parts of your mind because they rub people the wrong way in the world you grow up in. You pick up really quickly which parts of you make social stuff smoother and which cause trouble. And before you know it, you're editing yourself. Masking turns automatic way before you even realize what it's costing you. It's not on purpose. It's just how you survive. You learn softer voices and when to hold back a thought, or how to go along even when your head's somewhere else entirely. Eventually, you get so used to it that you think the mask is you. You believe the easier version for everyone else is the real one. It took me years to realize I'd built an entire identity around making myself smaller so others would feel better. And if I'm completely honest, I wasn't even good at that. The real me kept leaking out anyway. I've spent so much time around people who couldn't quite get me, and in that case, it leaves this low level loneliness that never really goes away. So, why do girls get taught so often to quiet their intensity, their logic, their independence? And how does all that shaping affect the identity they take into adulthood?
Because from the moment a girl shows signs of independence, clarity, or sharp thinking, the world quietly starts rearranging her edges. Not out of malice, out of habit, out of inherited scripts no one ever stopped to question. Intensity in boys is framed as energy. Intensity in girls is framed as too much. Logic in boys is ambition. Logic in girls is attitude. Independence in boys is leadership. Independence in girls is difficult. Those labels start landing long before a child has the language to understand what's happening. And children don't push back against social cues, they absorb them. If a 7-year-old girl realizes that being fully herself creates friction, she doesn't ask, "Is this script flawed?" She asks, "What version of me makes things smooth?" So she starts trimming. Softer voice, shorter statements, simpler questions, less visible intelligence, less visible certainty, less visible self. Not because she wants to, because the environment rewards the minimized version and punishes the real one. And here's the part that's hard to see until later. The mask doesn't feel like a mask at that age. It feels like adaptation. It feels like survival. It feels like being good. So by the time she reaches adulthood, she spent 20 years performing a distortion that was never hers to carry. The cost isn't the masking itself. Humans can adapt to almost anything. The cost is the identity formed around it. When you grow up rewarding yourself for being smaller, you enter adulthood unsure of the exact shape of your mind. You know what version keeps the peace. You don't always know what version is actually you. And the loneliness you described, that quiet, persistent undercurrent, comes from living in rooms where you were never fully present.
Yeah, stack all that up. The early gap, the pressure to fit, years of masking, and you end up with this belief that you're either too much or not enough, depending on where you are. You second guess your tone, your gut feelings, how your brain even works, instead of second guessing the framework that made you shrink in the first place. I carried that belief for years without looking at it closely. It was just background noise. I didn't question the story. I questioned myself. And when you finally unpack it, it's like letting out a breath you didn't know you were holding. So why do women like me grow up thinking we're too much, not enough, or just off somehow, when the problem was never really us, it was the structure?
Because when the structure is invisible, the self becomes the only thing left to blame. A child can't evaluate culture or gender scripts or generational expectations. A child only has access to one variable that feels adjustable: herself. So every moment of friction gets internalized as a personal flaw. Every misunderstanding becomes evidence that you're miscalibrated. Every mismatch between your mind and the environment feels like a failure of alignment, not a failure of the environment to account for your mind. And the tricky part is that the feedback isn't loud. It's subtle. It comes through tone, through silence, through the way adults respond when you're direct or confident or certain. The world rarely says, "You're wrong." It says, "Not like that." And over time, "not like that" becomes, not like you. That's how the story forms. Too intense, too logical, too blunt, not soft enough, not social enough, not feminine enough. The labels contradict each other, but they reinforce the same core message. The real you is slightly off. And because you've been hearing that message in 100 quiet ways since childhood, you don't question its accuracy. You treat it like a mirror, not a distortion. By the time you reach adulthood, that background noise has shaped your sense of self more than any explicit instruction ever could. It becomes the lens you evaluate your thoughts through. Not, does this environment fit me? But, why don't I fit it better? That's why dismantling the belief feels like a breath finally released. Because the moment you see the structure clearly, the gender script, the misclassification, the narrow template, the self-blame collapses. The weight was never yours. You were carrying the cost of a framework that couldn't imagine you.
Yeah, isn't that the truth? So anyway, all that we've covered so far has been the intuitive layer. It's the stuff you feel in your gut without needing studies to back it up. It's the experiences women know deep down, even if they've never said them out loud, and it's their lived reality and not theory. But now, I want to switch it up and dig into what's underneath. I want to talk about the psychology, the culture, the cognitive patterns that show why so many women with minds like mine carried the same confusion growing up. And it's not to dismiss what we feel, but to get to the forces that shaped it. Once the mechanics are clear, everything looks different. The question is no longer, what's wrong with me? It's, why was this box so damn small to begin with? So now let's pull back from the personal and see what the actual science says. None of this came out of nowhere. Look at cognitive research, and the patterns jump out over and over. Girls with minds like mine weren't rare. They just got overlooked or misread because they didn't fit what people expected. Most of my life, I thought I was the only one wired this way. Part of me wishes I'd known earlier that there were whole groups of women just like me, buried under old assumptions. What does the research really say about girls with analytical or systemizing minds? And why do those traits get missed or misunderstood so often in girls?
When researchers look at cognitive profiles across genders, one of the clearest findings is also one of the most consistently ignored. Analytical and systemizing minds show up in girls far more often than the cultural script ever allowed for. The traits were never rare. The recognition was. Part of the misunderstanding comes from diagnostic bias. For decades, studies were built around boys, their developmental patterns, their social behaviors, their communication styles. So the baseline for what analytical or systemizing looked like was modeled almost entirely on male expression. Girls with the same cognitive wiring often presented differently. Quieter intensity, internal logic, pattern recognition expressed through observation instead of overt behavior. Because they didn't match the male-coded presentation, they slipped past the radar. Another force is cultural scaffolding. From early childhood, girls are guided toward relational skills. Boys are guided toward mechanical or spatial ones. This doesn't change the underlying cognitive style, but it does change how it's interpreted. A girl who organizes information logically is described as mature or serious, not analytical. A girl who speaks directly is told she's strong-headed, not clear. The traits get reframed through a gendered lens, and the original meaning gets lost. There's also a social masking effect. Analytical girls learn early how to blend because blending reduces friction. They adapt to social norms more fluidly than boys, which makes the underlying cognitive structure harder to see. The mind doesn't disappear, it just becomes internalized. Adults mistake compliance for alignment. All of this creates the illusion that analytical girls are rare. They're not. They're simply misclassified. What happens internally, though, is the deeper cost. When your cognitive profile is invisible to the environment, you don't grow up seeing yourself reflected anywhere. So the traits that would have been strengths are instead experienced as outliers, not because they are, but because no one recognized them for what they were.
Yeah, looking at the data, one thing hits you right away, and that's how early the environment starts steering how we see things. Way before a girl knows who she is, she's learning what's right, which traits get a nod, which cause tension, and which get ignored. When your strengths don't line up with the script, that disconnect just becomes the air you breathe growing up. You pick up the rules without even realizing. And by the time you're ready to question them, they already feel like it's just the way things are. How do these rigid gender scripts mold a girl's identity, especially when her natural way of thinking doesn't match what everyone expects from her?
Rigid gender scripts work like invisible architecture, a structure a child grows up inside without ever being told it exists. And because it's invisible, it feels like reality, not instruction. The shaping starts long before conscious awareness. Adults respond differently to the same trait depending on whether they see it in a boy or a girl. Directness in boys gets praised as confidence. Directness in girls gets reframed as rudeness or attitude. Curiosity in boys is bright. Curiosity in girls is, why are you asking so many questions? A girl picks up on these micro responses quickly, and her mind starts reorganizing itself around them. Not because the trait is wrong, but because the environment signals that it will cost her something. Identity forms through that feedback loop. A child uses social reactions as her mirror. When the mirror consistently reflects discomfort around her natural strengths, she assumes the strengths are the issue. And because the script is woven into everything, family expectations, peer dynamics, media, schooling, she never sees an alternative model. She learns that adapting her personality is safer than expressing it. Without ever deciding to, she starts building an identity around what creates the least friction, not what matches her internal wiring. For a systemizing or analytical girl, the mismatch becomes structural. The traits that would make her thrive in many environments are the same traits that get muted in the social spaces she learns to navigate first. Over time, the gap between her internal cognitive style and her external identity widens. The script becomes the blueprint she uses to measure herself. And because the script doesn't include her, she always comes up short. By the time she has the awareness to question it, the adaptation feels like personality rather than conditioning. That's what makes the script so powerful. It shapes the self before the self is fully formed.
Oh, yeah, and that's where the confusion really piles on. When a girl's mind doesn't line up with the femininity, wow, I actually said that word. I usually struggle with it. Anyway, when it doesn't line up with the femininity she's shown, she starts hunting for reasons. Sometimes the only one around is maybe it's me. It's not because her body feels off, but because nothing around her mirrors how she thinks. I didn't question my body, like I said before. I questioned the script around it. And I had no clue there were other ways to explain the disconnect. That cognitive misreading could feel like gender confusion, when really the framework just never had room for someone like me. When girls get misread or mislabeled growing up, how does that turn into questioning their whole identity? And what does the evidence say about cognitive misalignment like this?
Identity confusion often begins as an attempt to solve a mapping problem, not a gender one. The mind is trying to locate itself inside the available categories, and when none of the categories match, it does what any intelligent system does under constraint. It searches for the closest explanation. Here's what the evidence shows when you zoom in on this pattern. When a girl's cognitive style is consistently misread, the mind experiences a form of interpretive drift. Over years of mismatched feedback, she stops evaluating the environment and starts evaluating herself. If the world treats logic, directness, or systemizing as not feminine, then the absence of recognition feels like the absence of belonging. And when belonging is tied to identity, the misread starts operating at the identity level. The mechanism is fairly direct. The girl shows traits that the environment hasn't coded as female. The environment reads those traits inaccurately. The girl internalizes the misreading. The internalization becomes a question about who she is instead of how she thinks. This is how cognitive misalignment gets mistaken for identity conflict. The mind isn't asking, "Am I a different gender?" It's asking, "Why does the version of womanhood presented to me feel like it excludes me?" And because children aren't given language for cognitive diversity, only gendered stereotypes, the brain assigns the confusion to the available narrative, even if it's the wrong one. Research in developmental psychology supports this. Identity exploration often rises when a child's internal traits don't match the external expectations they're surrounded by. Not because the identity itself is unstable, but because the environment provided an incomplete template. In that sense, questioning becomes a byproduct of misclassification. The mind is trying to reconcile a mismatch that was structural, not personal. Once the misclassification is corrected, once a woman realizes her cognitive profile was valid all along, the identity confusion dissolves. That's the clearest indicator that the issue was interpretive, not existential.
Yeah, the research also drives home another pattern we touched on, and that's masking. Girls pick it up early, not to trick anyone, but because it's how you cut down the friction between who you are and what people expect. And once it kicks in, it goes on autopilot. I didn't even realize that I was masking until way later. It felt so normal, I stopped seeing it. I'd built these habits around dodging conflict, dodging weird looks, dodging that too much feeling. I had no idea how much I was hiding just to fit places never meant for me. How early does masking start for girls? And what does psychology say about the long-term effects of pushing down natural traits just to fit in?
Masking starts surprisingly early. Developmental research puts the first signs around ages 4 to 6, which is exactly the window you described sensing the shift. That's the moment when children become aware that other people have expectations, even if no one says them out loud. Girls pick up those cues faster because they're socialized to maintain harmony. They're taught, directly and indirectly, that their social survival depends on reading the room accurately. So the minute a girl realizes her natural way of thinking or speaking creates friction, her mind starts adjusting. Not to deceive, to belong. The adaptation becomes automatic because it works. It reduces tension. It gets approval. And because the approval comes so young, the mask doesn't feel like a mask. It feels like who she's supposed to be. By the time she reaches adolescence, the adapted version of herself is so ingrained that she can't easily separate what came from her and what came from the environment. That has consequences that unfold quietly over time. When you suppress your natural traits long enough, you lose clarity about where your real personality actually sits. You start second-guessing your instincts because you learned early that they needed editing. You become hyper-aware of tone and delivery because part of your brain is running quality control on every interaction. And without noticing it, you start gravitating toward relationships where you can let the mask slip a little, though you may not even recognize why those relationships feel easier. There's also a slower, deeper impact. Identity formation gets delayed. If you spend childhood performing the version of yourself that creates the least friction, you don't get the usual developmental pattern of seeing your real traits mirrored back. Instead, you discover who you are in reverse, by noticing the relief that comes when you finally stop performing. And underneath all of this sits that quiet loneliness you mentioned earlier. It's the loneliness of being in rooms where people know the adapted version of you, but not the actual one. You can feel the difference even when you can't verbalize it. That's what psychology sees when it studies early masking, a survival strategy that ends up shaping the very identity it was meant to protect.
Once the whole structure comes into view, the mislabeling, the expectations, the masking, things really start shifting. The real you've kept tucked away starts to make sense. The confusion eases up. The blame moves off of you and onto the system. And best of all, you quit blaming your own personality for a disconnect that was never your fault. For me, getting the structure felt like reclaiming my mind. Granted, it didn't fix everything, but it brought some clarity. And clarity changes how you see yourself. When women finally get that the problem was structural and not inside them, what does research say happens to identity, confidence, and self-view?
When the framework finally comes into view, something quiet but profound starts happening. The mind stops treating every moment of friction as a personal flaw and begins to reinterpret it as context. And once that shift begins, the research shows a fairly consistent pattern. The first thing that changes is narrative coherence. Women describe it as their life lining up for the first time. All the moments that once felt like isolated failures suddenly connect to one structural explanation. And when the story becomes coherent, the self stops feeling defective. You're no longer trying to fix traits that were never broken. Confidence doesn't arrive as a surge. It arrives as relief. The pressure to monitor your tone, soften your language, or dilute your intensity eases because you realize those habits were responses to an environment, not reflections of your character. There's a recalibration where the mind switches from self-surveillance to self-recognition. You start trusting your own interpretations again, instead of cross-checking them against the script you were given. Identity shifts more gradually. It's less becoming someone new and more removing the constraints that kept you from showing up as yourself. Traits you once labeled as inconvenient become neutral, then valuable. The internal landscape rebalances. Women often describe it as a sensation of returning, even if they can't fully articulate what they're returning to. And there's another subtle but important change. Your boundaries become cleaner. When you no longer believe the problem originates inside you, you stop tolerating dynamics that require you to shrink. You develop a clearer sense of what environments support your mind and which ones distort it. That clarity tends to ripple outward into relationships, career choices, and even how you use your time. The overall arc is simple to name, but slow to live. Once the structure is visible, self-blame loses its authority. And when self-blame quiets, identity stabilizes. What emerges isn't a new person. It's the person who was there the entire time, just no longer filtered through a script that never accounted for her.
The tough part is that most women don't really start pushing back on the script until middle age hits. It's when the weight finally gets too heavy and they just stop bothering with the act.
It's true, and it's brutal when you think about the timeline. Most women don't reclaim their identity in their 20s or even their 30s. They reclaim it when the performance finally collapses under its own weight. Middle age becomes the breaking point, not because something inside the woman changes, but because the costs finally exceed the benefits. You spend decades trying to be legible to systems that were never designed with you in mind, and at some point, the effort just stops paying off. The mask cracks, not from rebellion, but from exhaustion. And once that happens, clarity rushes in almost instantly. What's interesting is that research backs this up. Identity consolidation for women, especially women with analytical or non-conforming cognitive profiles, often happens later in life. Not because they relate to maturity, but because the social script was so tight it delayed self-recognition. When the weight of expectations eases, even a little, the authentic cognitive profile starts surfacing fast. It's like a plant growing the moment the shade moves. And honestly, that late awakening is both liberating and infuriating. Liberating because you finally get to live as yourself. Infuriating because you realize how much of your life was spent in adaptation mode, performing a version of womanhood that never fit. But here's the deeper truth that sits underneath what you said. Women don't stop caring about the performance because they age. They stop caring because they finally see the architecture of the performance. Middle age isn't the trigger. Awareness is. Once a woman recognizes the structure for what it is, there's no going back. That's why the pushback begins then. Not because she becomes bolder, but because she becomes clearer.
Okay, so if you put the two layers together that we've been talking about, right, the felt experience and the evidence, it all gets a lot sharper. And the confusion so many women carry isn't some flaw in them. It's not missing femininity or not knowing who they are. It's what happens when you grow up in a box that was never built for your kind of mind. Analytical women, systemizing women, pattern-driven women, we've been here forever. We've just been mislabeled and shoved into wrong categories that didn't fit how we work. When you spend your whole childhood seen through the wrong filter, then yeah, you start seeing yourself wrong too. The disconnect was never inside. It was in how it was read. It was structural. You weren't a tomboy. You weren't too logical. You weren't too direct. You weren't lacking femininity. You just didn't fit the expected mold. But it was the mold that was the problem, and not you. Getting that, it doesn't wipe out the past, but it certainly reframes it. At least it did for me. It wasn't that I was out of place, I was miscategorized. And once that structure is visible, the need to cram into it fades. You quit forcing the fit and start seeing yourself for real. So Xenessa, this leads me to my last question for you today. If you had to boil everything we covered down to one key takeaway, what would that takeaway be?
The core takeaway is this. Misclassification shapes identity more powerfully than misbehavior ever could. When a girl's natural cognitive style doesn't match the template her environment assumes, she spends years adjusting herself to fit a framework that was never built to hold her. Over time, those adjustments become explanations, and those explanations become identity. Not because they're true, but because they're the only interpretations she was given. Once you see that the mismatch came from the script, not from the self, the entire narrative reorganizes. The traits you questioned stop looking like flaws, the friction stops feeling personal, and the story shifts from, I was wrong, to, the definition I inherited was incomplete. That clarity doesn't rewrite the past, but it returns ownership of the self. And for women with minds like yours, that shift is often the first moment their identity becomes something they shape consciously rather than something they spend their lives trying to justify.
You know, it all really boils down to something basic most of us never heard as kids. Nothing was ever wrong with how your mind worked. You got handed a script that left you out, and you did what any smart kid does. You tried to figure it out. You adapted. You squeezed in, even when it didn't fit who you were. When the script and the person don't match, the person usually blames themselves instead of the script. You're not alone there, and you're not the odd one out. You just weren't seen by a framework too limited to picture the kind of woman you are. Getting this doesn't erase feeling out of place all of those years, but it gives something those years didn't. It gives perspective. A way to look back and see the confusion wasn't proof of a flaw. It was proof that the definition you got was way too small for a mind like yours. If anything in this episode helped, I hope it's given you a clearer lens on yourself, not by changing you, but by lifting off the restrictions put on you. You deserved a bigger box than what you got. Now you get to build it yourself. If this episode gave you some clarity, consider subscribing so you can catch the next one. XP for the Mind doesn't follow a set path. We go where the real questions are. And I'd like you to come along for whatever's next. Thank you for joining us.